morning, church. How are we doing today? It's good to see all of you. This entire year, our church is studying out this concept of becoming, which sources itself in John 3, verse 30, where John the Baptist says, I must learn to become less and allow Jesus to be more. And so we're studying out this kind of transformational concept all year long. And this month, we're looking at the concept of hospitality as a part of our transformation. Now, I would say hospitality is one of those sneaky subjects. It sounds like it's a safe subject. It sounds like, okay, this isn't one, I could be more hospitable, I could give a little bit more, but this sounds like a subject that's going to be safe for the month. And I think today will be a day that will disabuse you of that idea of hospitality being a safe subject. It's actually one that God cares about intensely. And so we're going to be looking at that today. Walking in step with the will of God and following in the path of Jesus for his followers are easiest. It's easiest when that direction aligns with what our own experiences have taught us. All right, so for instance, you think about the concept of kindness, and you're like, yeah, I get that, because when people are kind to me, that's helpful. And so our own experiences then back up the very direction that Jesus wants to take us in, Yet, what sounds virtuous and what sounds practical for life doesn't always easily cooperate with one another. For instance, forgiveness as a concept, that makes sense when we're talking about valued relationships. When you're talking about someone else where you can count on the other person to be sensible. When you can count on the other person to also be generous and to reciprocate forgiveness. But Jesus' insistence on near limitless forgiveness, even in the case of those who are not sensible or remotely like-minded, is not something that always coheres with common sense in our understanding of the world. You know what I mean? Like, it's easy to forgive those who you know will love you and will forgive you. It's really hard to forgive those who, number one, aren't even asking for forgiveness, or secondly, who would never treat you with the same generosity. Life experience doesn't necessarily teach us the sound reasoning or logic of much of our Christian value system. Likely the effect of this kind of forgiveness must be generational in some way. Like, forgiving people limitlessly, we don't always get to see the positive impact of that in our own lifetime. Sometimes the impact of Christian virtue outlives our own lifespan. Does that make sense? So we don't get to experience the impact of the very things Jesus is asking us to obey. In general, I don't try to ask to understand the utility of following Jesus. You know what I mean? Like, I want to be the type of person that, like, when Jesus says jump, I just say, how high? I don't need you to explain it to me. I don't need you, to tell me all the reasons why. Until it becomes uncomfortable, or until what you're asking me becomes painful, or before what you're asking me puts me into conflict. And then I strenuously beg God to tell me the rationale behind the crazy thing he's asking me to do. But like the kind of forgiveness that God offers and thus expects from us, hospitality has a certain rationale that makes sense, but then it has a certain reasoning that lacks utter boundaries and doesn't make sense. Go ahead and open your Bibles to Leviticus chapter 19. Since I became a Christian, I began learning the art of talking to strangers. And I don't like it, personally. I have felt for most of my life that I have enough friends. And so I don't need to make more friends. And yet, in following Jesus, I feel compelled on a daily basis to reach out to the world that is around me. To not sit just uncomfortably in silence with a total stranger on the bus, or to not interact with the cashier. I feel that I'm being tasked by Jesus to talk to people around me. And I don't want to, but I also don't want to go home and feel guilty or convicted by my lack of courage. And so over 30 years of talking to strangers has given me the experience that many strangers are very, very unpleasant. You would think that over time of talking to strangers, like the experience of talking to strangers, Jesus is like saying, you'll get it. Like pretty soon you'll understand how good it is to talk to strangers, all right? And I don't know if that's a lesson Jesus was teaching. It's certainly one that I've not learned yet. My practical experience with strangers has not taught me that talking to strangers is good or logical, all right? And so this is one of those areas for my life. Like we're talking about hospitality the entire month. And so the entire time that I'm putting lessons together, I feel bad and convicted. And I feel like this isn't where I am personally strong. Like my own sensibilities don't align with what I'm having to teach here. And every lesson that I've done so far, I feel like I personally have to change. I have to become better in this. When you go to Leviticus chapter 19, we're entering a time in the Hebrew history where people are crystallizing their most powerful experience and memories to be a part of their personal identities and a part of their national identities. All right? This is a people that were slaves. Then they were a people that were escaped slaves. They were rescued slaves. They were wanderers in a desert. They were homeless. They were looking for a home. They were protected by their God. They were disciplined by their God. They were saved by miracles. They were undermined by basic infractions of morality. All right, all of these experiences and more became a part of their identity as a people. And when you get to Leviticus chapter 19 and they're codifying their law as a people, and God is telling them who they are to be. And he's leveraging these experiences as a part of this codification of their law system. In verse 33 of chapter 19, it says this, when a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, because you were foreigners in Egypt, and I am the Lord your God. And this law becomes a part of what is supposed to be cultural for them. Remember what you once were. Remember that you were rescued. Now be a rescuer yourself. An aspect of their most sacred covenant made with their Creator, all right? These things can't be simply translated into civil law. These are not things that can be the result of a vote. It must be a conviction built upon our identity and who God wants us to be. Does that make sense? All right, and this is what God is telling people. You were once slaves. You were rescued. You were once foreigners. I made you a home. Now go do it likewise. All right? Thus, for the Jew, the practice of hospitality became one of the most important cornerstones of their very community. The entire Old Testament narrative contains multiple stories of heroes and of villains, either practicing hospitality or refraining from practicing hospitality. The traditions of hospitality as extended to strangers likely begins in Genesis chapter 18 with the person of Abraham. I'm just going to read this in 18 verse 1. It says this, the Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre, where he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. Abraham looked up and saw 3 men standing nearby. When he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed low to the ground. He said, if I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, do not pass your servant by. Let a little water be brought, and then you may all wash your feet and rest under this tree. Let me get you something to eat so you can be refreshed and go on your way, now that you have come to your servant. Very well, they answered, do as you say. So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah. Quick, he said, get 3 seahs of the finest flour and knead it and bake some bread. Then he ran to the herd and selected a choice tender calf and gave it to a servant who hurried and prepared it. Then he brought some curds of milk and a calf that had been prepared and set these before them. While they ate, he stood near them under a tree. This short narrative begins a tradition of offering hospitality to complete strangers. It is one of the reasons Abraham is looked at the way he is, as the father of the Israelite tradition. Now, there are maybe mechanisms working within you right now to explain why Abraham did this. Because I know that when I see the traveling salesman walking up and down my street, I try and make sure he doesn't know that I'm home. I don't know if you've ever pulled up and you can see them and you're just hoping they don't see you pull into the garage. But I've never thought to myself, as the solar panel salesman knocks on my door, I don't know why, but in my neighborhood we have a lot of people selling solar to me. I don't know if you guys have that or not, but it feels like every other week. I have never opened the door, bowed low to the ground, and said, let me give you a steak and something to eat, and you come on in and let me serve you. That's never even remotely crossed my mind. All right, now, I remember one time I was working, and I came home, and I came inside, and there were 3 strangers in my house, and my wife was serving them hot chocolate, and I was like, what's going on here? First, I didn't see my wife. I just saw 3 strangers in my house. So I went immediately into fight mode, and I think the guy saw it in my eyes, because he went, your wife invited us in. And I was like, of course. And I don't even know what they were selling. All I know is that for the next hour, we were feeding them and talking to them, and all I wanted to do was go downstairs in my office and do something else. But my wife has the instinct and the conviction to serve strangers. I have the instinct to avoid them at all costs. And so when I read this verse, I want to explain it away. I want to explain Abraham's behavior away. And I think we have to stop doing that. Interestingly enough, this short story is set over and against the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Many people assume that the reason for the destruction of those 2 cities was their deviant sin and behavior. But that was not the motivating factor in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, especially because those horrible events are set directly against this moment of hospitality by Abraham. The 3 men that he's giving hospitality to are on their way to Sodom and Gomorrah. As a matter of fact, Ezekiel 16 describes the destruction this way in verse 49. Now this was the sin of your system, Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and the needy. Isn't that incredible? The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is because they did not show hospitality. Because they were overfed and they were greedy. Where Abraham saw strangers and immediately made them food, Sodom and Gomorrah did not. And God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah for their arrogance. It is why the treatment of guests, wayfarers, and strangers is such an important virtue to the Jewish people, because it matters to God. And this is where we might begin to feel a little bit uncomfortable. It matters to God to the degree that he destroys cities where greed is its ruler and there's no longer a place for hospitality. It is to this very story that the author of Hebrews refers in Hebrews 13:2. Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing so, some people have shown hospitalities to angels without knowing it. That's a direct reference to Abraham. 1,000 years of stories and temple service and community remembering the time of their oppression and rescue expressed through hospitality. That is the Jewish people. For the average man and woman growing up within the Israelite culture, sharing your tables with others was just a given. Now here's a point of interest. The Bible has over 100 directives for hosts. All right, there's over 100 verses about showing hospitality. That's incredible to me. That's a lot of direction for one type of behavior, all right? Now, what I was hoping for is that there would be an equal amount of direction towards guests. All right, like you're going to show hospitality, here's how hosts should act, but if you're going to be a guest, all right, here's about 20 things you need to remember. All right? And in the Bible, I could find only 2 directives towards guests. 2, that's it. One was in 2 John, where he's instructing the church not to show hospitality to false teachers. Don't have them in, don't say goodbye to them, don't give them any attention. All right? And that was a very specific thing that was happening. There's another one in Proverbs 25 where it basically says if you want to learn how to be influential and liked among your neighbors, don't invite yourself over to their house too often. All right? I like that directive. I wish there was a little bit more of that in the Bible, but that's it. That's it. A lot of directives towards hosts, almost no directives towards guests. All right? I find that somewhat disconcerting. I want the Bible to say things like this. Hey, if you've squandered your own money doing stupid things, then don't ask everybody else for something. Like, I kind of wanted to say that. Like, hey, you kind of made your bed, why don't you lie in it? All right? That's not in there. Or, how about this? If someone shows you hospitality, then please make your visit brief. And leave as soon as possible without them having to ask you. Now, hey, this is my sinful nature, and please, I know some of you are like-minded, all right? Now's not the time to sit on your high horse because God sees your heart right now. Or I wish the Bible sometimes said this, if you're a guest, make sure that you're grateful and show some respect to your host. But none of that is in there. None of it. It's almost as though the Bible is set up so that the host could be taken advantage of. I think that's by design. I think there's purpose in this. I think all of this helps us better understand the position that God has placed himself in as it relates to humanity. We need to think of our inhabited world, the place where we exist, as the place that is God's. God created this. We did not. We live as guests in this place where God created. He is our host. He cares for us. He makes sure that we have roofs over our heads. He gives us food to eat. He loves us. He sacrifices for us. But he also has no guarantee that we, in return, will be good guests. We can take advantage of him whenever we want, and we often do. We can choose to be grateful or not to be grateful, and often we are not. We can choose to obey the rules of his house or not. And it's not like he just flicks us into outer space if we disobey. We still get to live here. Now, I'm not saying there's no consequences, there's no cause and effect for the way that we live, but I'm saying in general, God continues to host us. He continues to give us chance after chance after chance, even though we are the worst guests imaginable. Like he cleans up the house and right away we mess it up. We're breaking stuff left or right. We don't even know that we're doing damage at times. We're taking advantage of his good graces. We are the worst guests imaginable. And yet God continues to be a faithful host. While God could exercise his full control over this place, as his guest, he could kick us out. He could stop caring. He could punish endlessly, but he does not. He has almost limitless patience with us. He continues to be a blessing to us, even as we offer half-hearted thanks and then ask for more. See, God is a good host, while his guests are often poor. He remains a faithful host. Hospitality, I think, for us is a way to understand what it is God is doing. You know, when Jesus begins his ministry, he takes this concept of hospitality another step further. He wants his followers to begin to think about hospitality from a wholly new perspective. And actually, Dante referred to this earlier in the welcome. In Matthew 25:34, it says, "Then the king will say to all those on his right, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father. Take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me.'" And they go on to say, "When did we do this for you?" And he says, "Whenever you did this for anybody, you did it for me." Jesus is not simply teaching, as some of the Proverbs say, that the ill treatment of the poor is offensive to God. Jesus now says that how you treat with the lowliest among you is how you treat with me. Now, I think a difference that I want to point out is that people believed back then, almost unilaterally, that if you were poor, it's because you were sinful. And criminals had no status. I mean, there's just, in our day and age, we have a much more virtuous outlook on the poor and the needy than they did back then, okay? And I think the poor and the needy to us would probably be different than what it was to Jesus. So if Jesus were to translate the poor and needy in his day, it would be something different for us. It would be something that you naturally revile. It would be something that you disdain. It would be something that you think they deserve this. They did something wrong, and that's why they're in this position. Criminals, people who take advantage of others and are penalized for it. You know, it would be the reviled of our society. That's who Jesus is talking about. When you take care of those people, then you're also taking care of me. I think it's a super uncomfortable thing that Jesus is saying here. We've tried to make it more comfortable, but it's not comfortable. I think some of the people that you would care for, perhaps other Christians would go, dude, what are you doing? Like, why are you spending time with this person? Like, this is not a good look for Christianity when you do this. And I think what Jesus is saying is when you care for the lowliest, meanest, then you are caring for me. In the arena of world religion, you don't find many all-powerful gods who state, when you see the beggar, the lame, the villain, the prostitute, the prisoner, you see me. What is the utility in that to civilization? What is the practical outcome of looking at the world this way? You know, there's this human tendency for us to beg for mercy in some area of our life that brings us shame, while then crusade with self-righteousness and unabandon in other areas of our lives. The person with the pornography addiction on one hand, crusading against the rich and powerful on the other hand. The person with the gambling problem on one hand, railing against those who don't align with social issues they passionately pursue on the other hand. The spouse that desires patience and mercy with their spending habits, but then attacks their partner for their laziness. It's as if we somehow believe that we can make up for our deficiency, for our sin and our shame in one area of our lives by self-righteously or publicly crusading against sin in some other area of life. It's an asymmetrical moralization that we do. Personally, I think the unreasonable expectation of hospitality that God gives and God expects from us has the cumulative impact of destroying that kind of self-righteousness within us. His brand of hospitality nurtures generational mercy within a person and within a community. You know, after my freshman year of college, I wasn't a Christian or anything, and I was living in this house with, I played in a band through college, and so we all got a house together, and we had like a studio down in the basement, and we just played music all summer. And that summer, I got a job as a butcher, so I was a butcher all summer long. And it was a friend of mine from a different school. His dad owned the butcher shop, Jameson Meats. If you look it up, still on Anthony Street in Fort Wayne, Indiana. I got the job there. What I did not realize when I got the job is that the owner of the place only hired ex-convicts and me. So the entire summer, I'm working with people who spent a significant portion of their lives in prison. All right, and I loved. They had so many stories. I loved these guys. They were amazing. I didn't know what questions I was allowed to ask, which ones I wasn't. You know, I was super inappropriate times. I remember the first time I found out, I was like, "So what were you in prison for?" And then I got a lecture and why that's not a good question to ask anybody. And you know, and I learned so much. And you know, it opened my eyes to something as a young man that wouldn't have been opened if I not spent the entire summer with them. You know, and some of what I thought about those black and white ideas about people began to be destroyed that summer. A whole gray area of my life began to open up. You know, some of them talked very openly about what had happened in their lives. Some of them did not. The experience of that summer and spending most of my time with that group of men has informed my view overall of people who have been in prison. Now, I'm not foolish enough to believe that that one experience should be the lens through which I view everything. All right, I think that's a bad habit that people have. They have one experience and now they view everything through that lens. But it's enough of an experience, perhaps, to eliminate the most extreme ideas that I would have had, good or bad. My point is that through our experiences, especially when they happen to us as practicing disciples of Jesus, the world starts to become a little bit more clear. The world as presented through the eyes of the world is an absurd thing. The world describing itself is what I mean. When the world describes itself, the world seems more scary than it really is. It can seem more hostile than it really is. It can seem safer than it really is. It can seem better than it really is. It can seem more lonely than it really is, and it can seem more comfortable than it really is, all at the same time. It's one of the reasons I'm not a big fan of people scrolling through social media a lot. Because they get an inundation of a viewpoint that I believe is usually wholly unreliable and not super useful for walking through the world. Or why I think judging the world based upon the presentation of any media, be it news, podcast, or video, is utter foolishness. I see all of it as an infection, something that gets inside of you and makes you sick. It makes an illness to your judgment. It will blind you. It makes you stupid, I think. A lumbering, gibbering idiot and a mockery of God's image. I say turn it off. Turn off the news. Turn off your phone. Leave your echo chambers of pundits and crusaders who speak only to what gratifies your personal sensibilities. And then go and invite real people into your home. Go find the distasteful and the ugly aspects of your society and offer them a meal. Sit with those you consider to be strange and otherly. Be a host that has no limits. This is when we unknowingly entertain angels and messiahs. It's when we become better. It's when we are better able to see. It's how we become better at understanding what it is God is doing with this fallen world. He is making room for people, and he's asking us to do the same. Amen. Thank you very much.